If it's true that the current mobility model is not sustainable and that technological innovation is not the only response we can give to try and reduce external costs and make it more adequate for ensuring possibilities for future generations to meet their own mobility needs, then we need to understand how come this model is this way and how come it is so centered on the prevailing use of private means of transport. We'll see that there are multiple factors underlying current mobility decisions in the European context. We're going to review them, and what I'd like to emphasize is that the majority of these factors are related to the so-called humanities, to the anthropological, social, cultural, psychological, cognitive, socio-economic, geopolitical dimensions, so to the humanities. That is why mobility has been included among the 6 global challenges by Politecnico, because technological innovation is key for the 3rd step of ASI, for improve. However, it works only as long as it is matched with social cognitive approaches to the dimension of humanities. That is why you'll have technological experts as well as experts in humanities. So this review of factors underlying the current mobility demand to impact on so as to shift, to promote a shift, to reduce the need to move or to do it in a less impactful way, well, these 2 steps of the ASI strategy can greatly benefit from integrated policies combining technological innovation with sensitization, information, and educational campaigns. Let's begin with the anthropological factors. Human nature, the human being, human needs, regardless of space and time of the society and culture where people live. Anthropological features, the way human beings have evolved over time and how they've come to be what they are today. A first need is to save body energy, because when you move, it takes energy. It's a physical energy. In active mobility modes, when I move on foot or I use a bike, that's the type of energy I need, or else I need fuels. So there's an intrinsic need for human beings not to scatter their energies, because they need their energies for various activities. This is the so-called Eurobarometer carried out every year by the EU. Well, 20 years ago, people were asked to indicate, in 2020, what were the main reasons for their decisions about the mode they wanted to use to move, and which was mainly cars. And you can see that over 40% of respondents said that they decided to move by car because they wanted to be comfortable. When I drive a car, I don't have to walk, I don't have to spend energy using a bike. I choose who can come or can, come with me in the car. I can listen to music. I don't have to walk. I don't have to drive a bike, I don't have to reach the first bus stop, I don't have to be with people I don't know, maybe, there's no air conditioning in public transport, etc., etc. Now, if this is the main reason, well, clearly, using a car is the obvious choice, because it certainly grants the greatest comfort for a trip. So if we consider this as a human need, it means that a shift will not occur if I don't make the new transport modes more comfortable, or, for example, using air conditioning and so on and so forth. However, there's another need which may sound a little contradictory, but it's just complementary. It's the need to move. It is as if a human being needed to move every day, either on foot or driving a bike or driving a car, for a certain amount of time every day. How can that need be described? At the end of the 70s, Jakob Zahavi of the World Bank carried out some empirical surveys and found out that the average time devoted by people to move during the day tends to be constant, regardless of the geographical area, regardless of the period of time considered historically. So he called it the travel time budget. It is as if every one of us had a certain time that every day we devote to mobility. Here you can see Cesare Marchetti on the left, an anthropologist working in Austria in the Institute for Applied Systems, and I tried to give an explanation for this, and he explained it as a balance between two primary original needs of our ancestors. On the one hand, the need to move away from the cave, from the shelter, to find food, to hunt for food, to pick fruits, etc. And at the same time, the need not to move away too far, not to be exposed to the risk of attack by predators. According to Marchetti, 60-70 minutes are probably the right trade-off between these two contrasting needs. And this has turned into a habit repeated from generation to generation for such a long time that you do it any long because of the original reasons, but it's so intrinsic to human beings that it's become an anthropological need, regardless of where I live or of my culture. And it's not by case that prisoners have an hour during the day to be outdoor. This is a chart showing how the travel time budget remains more or less stable between 1 hour, 1 hour and a half, between 60 and 70 minutes, both in African villages and in cities from China to Japan to Brazil to the US and China, and whether you're also considering national surveys, small towns, not just large cities. So regardless of income, the average time devoted by people in all these contexts is about an hour per day. Now, this has a very strong implication on transport planning and for technological innovation and infrastructures. it means that if the implementation of a new infrastructure, shifting from regional trains, for example, to high-speed trains, enables me to take a lower amount of time for the same trip, the time I save will not be devoted to reading or to exercise, but to further trips. Not really in terms of the number of trips, but lengthening the average distance of a trip. Now, this is the historical series based on a survey carried out every year in the UK from 1970 to 2015, 40 years. You can see that the number of hours devoted to mobility a year tends to be about 360, 370 per year, so 1 hour a day. The average number of trips remains the same. What has grown in the past 40 years is the average length of trips. Well, of course, technological innovation for private vehicles and buses or trains or airplanes increased the speed of these trips. And so what did people do? They used the time saved thanks to the faster speed, not adding new trips, but lengthening their usual trips. For example, people may decide to go to another gym, which is not in the same neighborhood. It's in a different neighborhood because it may offer richer opportunities. Or one might decide to go to the shopping mall near the motorway because it's bigger, it offers more. So if we think of solving congestion problems and pollution, of course, because people stuck in traffic will consume more fuel, if we add the fourth lane in the motorway, in the ring road, to make traffic more fluid, or introducing let's say faster itineraries in navigation system, I may have positive results at short term, but in the long term, people will use the time they save to lengthen their trips and therefore increase traffic flows. That's called the black hole of infrastructural investments. So I increase supply without considering elastic demand. The more fluid the traffic and the more let's say, can move during the day, and the higher the congestion in the longer term in that infrastructure. So the usual, let's say, response, which was chasing demand and offer new infrastructures when demand is saturated, so it no longer applies. We want to prevent demand from increasing. That would no longer be the solution. We have to intervene to change demand, and therefore neglecting anthropological factors would go to the detriment to technological innovation and would certainly make it inefficient. Then there are a number of factors that are associated to cognitive and psychological factors. Very often in mathematical models, passengers are considered perfectly rational. So the assumption is that when going for a trip, they consider all possible options. They assess the time required, the amount of financial resources required, the amount of comfort or discomfort involved. So the assumption is that they assess all these options and they choose the optimum one. As a matter of fact, and similarly to Homo economicus in economic sciences, the assumption is that they assess all the options from the economic viewpoint. However, our cognitive skills are much more limited. We often don't rely on all the required information. We can't compare any limited number of options. Of course, there are tools available, Google Maps, for instance, and so we can choose among different itineraries, but we don't always use Google to make a decision about where we want to go and when we want to go. Having said that, there's an additional issue. The information we process are sometimes incorrect. Not only our cognitive skills are not perfect, but they're based on insufficient or incorrect information or wrong perceptions. Think about the time taken for a trip. If you ask a person, what is the ideal mode of transport to move in the city up to 4 or 5 kilometers? And people will say the car. Unless you have the underground, very, very close to departure and destination. Actually, if we consider door-to-door trips, including parking time, up to 5 kilometers, up to this distance, the fastest way to move, at least in peak hours, is the bike. Many surveys have been carried out from, same trip from A to B, using different modes and measuring the time required, and up to 5 kilometers using a bike seems to be, or turns out to be the most efficient way. Well, 5 kilometers it means, for example, in the case of Turin, the entire city, the whole radius. And that means that 75% of trips in cities in the EU are lower than 5 kilometers, but actually people move by car in 75% of cases instead of using a bike. Why? Because we tend to look at the maximum speed reached by a car. We look at acceleration, and that's why we say the best way to reach that destination is the car, when instead a bike is more efficient. By the way, when you use a car, time might vary despite, the same distance. Sometimes, you may have traffic, or you may have works in progress, or it takes 5 minutes to find a parking lot, and the following day I can find the parking place immediately, etc. When you use a bike, you can bypass traffic jams, and so the time required remains more constant. So if I move from the assumption that the car is the fastest way up to 5 kilometers, well, my cognitive process will drive me towards a suboptimal choice. It's not the optimal choice because it's based on a wrong assumption. And here is another similar example. Here is a link to The Guardian, the British newspaper, based on an experiment carried out in Camden Town by the King's College of London. So they asked 4 people during peak hours to move from A to B in a traffic intensive segment, one by car, one by bus, and each one of them had a filter measuring the amount of PM10 that person would breathe. Of course, when air is very polluted, and we often experience that in Turin, well, people decide to take their car because they think, that being in their internal compartment, they'll be less exposed to pollution whereas outside they would be more directly exposed. Now, if you look at the scientific literature, you'll find that similar surveys were carried out in very different contexts, but they all led to the same results. They show that whoever drives a car breathes a double amount of PM10 compared to those moving on foot and especially by bike. And those going on foot or using a bike in a less congested road breathe even less pollutants. So emissions tend to be accumulated and to stagnate in the internal compartment, reaching higher concentration compared to outdoors. And sometimes, yes, you may be exposed to mufflers emissions, but then, the air is circulated by the wind, by precipitations, and therefore, paradoxically, I wrongly think that I should use my car and I don't take my bike because I don't want to breathe those pollutants. So I drive my car. However, I end up breathing more PM10, and with that trip, I will contribute to further worsen the quality of air in the city. Now, this has emerged in several interviews and in several surveys. I'm referring to this wrong assumption. And it's really prevailing in the thinking of many people. So it's a cognitive factor, not a technological factor, driving people to use a car, although the car is not the optimum means of transport to be used. So launching sensitization campaigns is important to prevent, not to stultify the benefits of the technology, because with the technology you reduce emissions, but then you end up breathing more pollutants if you make the wrong decision and use a car instead of a bike. Another contradiction between individual and collective choices, the so-called free rider problem. Well, you may have read in newspapers about surveys showing that 70-80% of respondents say that they are aware that traffic and pollution are not acceptable, and they say they are ready. They agree to reduce car trips, but then the majority of people continue to use their cars despite their theoretical intention. Well, actually, the effect of their individual choices are linked to collective choices. If I give up using my car and I use the bike, but all the others still use the car, and I think that I am more exposed to pollution compared to using a car, I will hardly persist. I'll probably think, before the others do it, why should I do it? Why should I expose myself first? And I continue to use the car. And then, of course, if they all decided to take a bite, the person using a car might think, well, I'm the only one, so I can continue to use my car, considering that the traffic has become more fluid. So it's hard to combine individual with the collective choices, and therefore people are stuck and they don't change their habits. And here we come to habits, to this additional factor. What is the role of habits? A habit is an automatic choice. It simply follows the trend of past choices. I simply repeat what I've been doing up to that moment. If I've been using a car, in the end, using a car has become a habit. I take my car even for other types of trips. For example, Let's say I have to go to a different destination, which is very close to the underground, and I live close to the underground, but I'm used to my car because I usually go to the office, which is far away for public means of transport. Well, I'm very likely to take the car automatically, just as a habit, without even asking myself whether taking the car is the best way in terms of time and comfort to reach that destination. Maybe it would be better to take the underground. But if I don't even assess, or if I don't even compare the two decisions, and just out of habit, I take the car just because I always take my car to go somewhere, well, I tend to reproduce a mobility system centered on the car, even to the detriment of my best possible choices. Japan carried out several studies about braking habits, braking patterns, and promoting different behaviors, even temporarily, experimenting different optimum choices. So when you break a pattern, for instance, when you move somewhere else, and of course I have to take a different transport mode to go to school, or let's say I get registered at university, or I have to go to a different venue. Well, that is the right time to, I don't know, for example, offer a free subscription, monthly subscription to public transport, because that way I can consider public transport as the best alternative. And before I get used to take my car to go to school or to university, experimenting that new way, I may have a positive experience of an alternative means of transport. Or another good idea would be to gift people a bike for a year, so that people get used to it. And for example, think of Amsterdam or Copenhagen. There are very good trails there, and if you get used to it, you really learn to appreciate it compared to suboptimal modes. So we've considered anthropological factors, we've considered cognitive and psychological factors as well. Now, regardless of society, regardless of culture, but let's talk about culture now. Let's talk about the values of a given culture. One of these values is the car as a status symbol. Not really owning the car, but the type of car you own. In the second post-war period, that happened already in the post-war period after the First World War in the US, but in Europe, after the First World War, cars were not owned by everyone. However, in the second post-war period, people got richer and they could afford a car, and so owning a car was a status symbol. It was a confirmation of your ability to earn an income. It was an indication of social success, so it became a social symbol. Now cars are so prevalent. Let's take a look at Italy. 2 cars every 3 people. And if we include 2-wheeled vehicles, it would probably be 1 per person. So cars are so widespread that it's not really owning a car that is a status symbol. Well, sometimes is when you don't own a car, that becomes a status symbol. For example, you use a bike as a symbol of alternative values compared to mainstream ones. What still is a status symbol is the type of car you own, because it's seen as a success confirmation when you own a large car, a car that looks aggressive, powerful, that shows the ability to impose your presence. And this is quite visible in the evolution of models. This is the picture, let's say, of 3 fronts of BMW cars from the 70s onwards. They become more and more similar to, let's say, the nose of animals. It is as if you were saying, get off the way, here I am aggressive, I am powerful, I will lead the way to the detriment of others. Well, that is not just visible in design, it's also apparent in statistical data. If you look at the average size of cars and their power, in the models registered in 2001, 10, and 20, if we take the values of 2000 as of 100, you can see that the average engine power has grown. We buy more powerful cars, and also the size of cars has increased. Think of SUVs, wider, taller, and also they weigh more, and their fronts are more aggressive too. And of course that may cause greater damage, of course, to smaller cars or to weaker targets, let's say. Now, this is linked to human culture, but it has a strong impact on the efficacy of technological innovation, because if it's true that on the one hand engines have become more efficient, on the other hand the risk to lose these benefits can be traced back not only to the longer distances covered, longer trips, but also to the weight of these vehicles, of new vehicles. Let me make myself understood. Let's take a Volkswagen Golf. The model dating back to 2012, Euro 5, well, maximum emissions set by the EU were such that a 1.4 liter 90 kilowatts, so that's the power, would emit 123 grams per kilometer. Now, generally speaking, when you buy a new model, you tend to buy a bigger car, a more powerful car. Now, let's say I want to sell that second-hand car and I buy a new model, well, more or less similar. So if I choose a similar one, of course it's Euro 6 this time, I have a more efficient engine, piston displacement 1.5, almost 98 kilowatts. So despite this slightly larger dimension, thanks to technological innovations, the grams of emissions are just 108 instead of 123, and you can see the impact of technological innovation. But what is the issue here? If I decide to buy the slightly more powerful model, Euro 6, but piston displacement 2 liters, 180 kilowatts, well, emissions go up to 149 grams. And even considering the same kind of distance covered compared to the previous model. So if we don't change the cultural values which drive me to buy bigger cars, more powerful cars, it's useless to make engines more efficient and reduce emissions, because the final outcome will be that emissions will tend to grow rather than to drop because of this mindset. This is a book by Alan Walks, a geographer and urban planner in Toronto, who introduced the term auto mentality. So he highlighted the strong link between the values associated to what is also called automobility, the transport system based on cars, so freedom, flexibility, autonomy. So, if you take your car, you may decide how and when. You can listen to your own music, you can choose the itinerary without being bound by the schedules of buses, trams, etc. So there's a strong link between this auto mentality and the general values of neoliberalism. Well, that's actually the mainstream in Europe. And it's based on individual success, on individualism, on freedom, on autonomy. So much so that every action limiting the use of cars is seen by many people as an attack to cultural rights, to autonomy, to freedom. It's a limitation to the prevailing values. And paradoxically, one of the most expensive and impactful technologies that we use, the car, is considered a mass means of transport, reflecting common values, whereas the bike, which was prevailing at the beginning of the 20th century, is now considered a sort of elite mode of transport used by those who don't want to conform to mainstream values. So once again, you will notice the cultural relevance of using a car. And this dimension must become the object of specific sensitization and information campaigns if I want to be successful in shifting the use of cars in absolute terms and also reduce it as in terms of its share in modal transport. Let's now also consider another set of factors, social economic factors. And here are some of them. This is a chart from 0 to 24 hours, the number of trips in Turin in 1979, when the first survey was carried out on people's mobility choices, on residents' mobility choices. And this is the same survey carried out in 2013 by the Piedmontese Mobility Agency. Well, there are similarities between the two charts, except for this visible difference. 3 peaks, 3 peak hours in this chart, and only 2 here. There is no intermediate peak at lunchtime. 40 years ago, people used to stop for lunch 1 or 2 hours, so many people would go back home and have lunch with their family, or they would go back from school. Now lunch breaks are much shorter, and only very few people will go back home during that time. Well, a skyline of this type is much easier to serve with public transport. There'll be trams and buses occupied 3 times a day on trips between the home and the workplace, for instance, on stable itineraries. Whereas this situation is more favorable to cars because of various reasons. So there is no third peak, and that means that trams, buses, and trains will be used less. So there is no, let's say, filling in the middle of the day. And then these trips are no longer consistent, are no longer systematically repeated every day, every, let's say, working day of the week and every week in the year. So in that case, it would be easy to plan public transport to serve those directions and those times. Now we're confronted with non-consistent trips, not associated to reach the workplace or the university, but associated to leisure time, sports activities, seeing friends. So if in the 80s consistent trips accounted for about 2/3, they now account for 1/3 only. It's the other way around. 2/3 are non-consistent trips. And by this I mean in unforeseeable and very differentiated directions and times every day. And so it's much more difficult to meet these needs with public transport. It's much easier using a car because, one day I go to the gym and then the other day I go to the library, or I go somewhere else for a sports activity. So there's an increasing differentiation in lifestyle. These are 14 lifestyles identified by Eurisco, and they are more and more differentiated in terms of mobility, of consumption, of the time devoted to each activity. So the more differentiated they are in a population and the more diverse the mobility choices of people, and the more difficult, of course, competing with a means of transport, cars, which offers you great versatility. So there has been an evolution in lifestyle in terms of consumption patterns, for instance, which goes to the benefit of cars and to the detriment of collective transport and active mobility. Another social factor is teleworking. We call it smart working. Of course, it boomed with the pandemic, but already in 2019, teleworking was considered one of the options of the, let's say, priorities for ASI, which was part of Avoid. So let's work from home and let's reduce the need for moving from home to the workplace. Let's go back to Mr. Marchetti and Marchetti's constant. If it's true that moving once a day is a need rather than a choice, well, maybe the time I save in not moving from home to my workplace, well, that time can be used for other trips related to leisure time, non-consistent, more diverse trips. Rather than staying home reading a book, I may go to swim, or I may go out for shopping, etc. Well, this is a survey carried out in Switzerland in 2010 and then repeated in 2015. So in the end, people teleworking tend to travel more mileage per week compared to those who actually go to work by car or using means of transport. And these trips are more, let's say, diverse. They're not consistent, so they tend to be by car. So teleworking should be considered attentively, since the risk is to have more negative effects, more non-consistent trips compared to the people actually going to the office. Well, people choose to work from home may reside further away from their workplace, or when they drive to work, they already travel a long distance or a longer distance, or when they decide to work from home, they may take, for example, a new house in the outskirts of the city to have a bigger home, and so they save some mileage, but that mileage is used to generate new trips and very often non-consistent trips. Another socioeconomic factors which boomed with the pandemic is that of e-commerce, is that of online shopping and last mile delivery. It's hard to say whether e-commerce is better than the conventional model. It very much depends on each individual context. E-commerce implies that deliveries actually reach people in their homes, so many delivery points using light vehicles which we know are more pollutant than others. So it's difficult to say whether this type of home deliveries generate less pollution compared to individuals going for shopping, in conventional shops. Well, it depends where they go or where they used to go. Did they go to the little shop in the neighborhood, or they went to the shopping mall very far away because of lower prices and they had to take their car? And they would move between, different shops and buying different shops to take advantage of discounts, etc. So it's not easy to decide. You may consider, for example, electric light vehicles or combustion engine vehicles. It depends on the regulations adopted by each city, granting or not granting access to these vehicles in old city centers, or based on exhaust gas emissions, etc., and parking regulations. Well, undoubtedly, it's a multidimensional challenge with strong occupational implications too, because both the drivers of light vehicles, of vans for door-to-door deliveries, and bikers with last mile deliveries, they are exposed to working conditions that are extremely unfavorable, in some cases bordering on being inhuman. So we should tackle this issue with a multidimensional approach and not just consider the impact on transport. And now we go back to Marchetti's constant. Those of you who take the course of sustainable urban mobility will find it over and over again. So it has a strong relevance for the shape of cities and the relation between the shape of settlements and their relation with transport. According to Marchetti, we move 1 hour a day for an hour a day, and therefore, according to the means of transport I use, the part of the city that I can reach may vary. 2 Australian scholars, Newman and Kenworthy, and this is a key book in the literature for planning. So they highlighted that over the centuries, 3 ideal types of cities can be identified, and they're closely correlated to the prevailing mode of transport. The first is the so-called walking city, the compact pedestrian city, Well, that was prevailing up to 1850, when people would move on foot. Now, if I can only move on foot and I move for 1 hour a day, so 4 kilometers an hour, that's the average speed, it means 4 kilometers to go and 4 kilometers to go back. Now, if we look at the city plan at that time, actually the radius of the city would be 4 kilometers. So at the borders of the city, so starting from, let's say, the outskirts to reach the center would actually take 4 kilometers. It's a very dense, compact city with a very high inhabitants density with mixed soil uses, so that when I move from the outskirts to the center, I can find many different shops, various opportunities to social interaction without scattering my trip too much. So it's an organic city. Cities may be located on top of hills or parallel to the actual edge or the slope if the hills are very elongated. This model prevailed till 1850. If you take, major capitals of the past, Rome, Babylon, they do not exceed a radius of 4 kilometers. If you take Venice, for instance, the pedestrian area has a radius of 4 kilometers because that's the need. The situation changed in the second part of the 19th century with the spreading out of trams and then steam engines and then internal combustion engines and then trains, which increased the average speed and the average distance that could be traveled. So what used to be the compact city spreads out, reaches a larger size and becomes polycentric. So around the nodes of railway stations, then I can have smaller settlements, maybe 1 kilometer. So from my residence, I can reach the railway station and take a train, reach the city center in 10 minutes, and then go back. So that is called the transit city, a city based on public transport when cars were still absent. So it's a polycentric city with many nuclei around the nodes of public transport. After the First World War in the US and in the Second World War, post-World War period, we witnessed the onset of the automobile city because cars enable people to move faster than by bus and at 360 degrees. People can reach even those parts of the city which are located between one and the other railway segment and which is served with a very widespread road network. So the distance that can be covered goes up to 20 kilometers. These are not alternative cities. These cities develop very consistently with a very low speed and a separation of land use. Zoning is introduced with the separation of land uses. So I no longer have a neighborhood in the city with, have a mix of shops, homes and industry. So there are separate zones are introduced, and indeed when you drive a car you can easily reach one area or the other according to what I need to do. Hence sprawling, which is so prevalent in the US and Australia. This is Los Angeles. So a very sprawled city with homes for individual families or two families. Here you can see Las Vegas with a tree-shaped road network. And of course, using a car is essential here. Density is so low that at every bus stop, a bus would only take one or two passengers. Itineraries would be very, very scattered and long, and they would only take few passengers with very diverse destinations. They might have to go to work in the industrial area, or they might have to go shopping in a completely different place. So this is called the automobile city. Outside the city, old centers in the American and Australian context, but also in Europe, in London and around Italian cities too, especially in the northeastern part of Italy, in industrial districts, it's been the prevalent model of urban expansion in the past 20-30 years. Now, a city of this kind cannot work based on public transport. It requires people to use a car. So if you move to Las Vegas, first you need to buy a car, because you wouldn't even be able to reach your home. Public transport is often non-existing, and because it would be extremely inefficient. Now, if I wish to promote an avoid and shift strategy, so deterring people from using cars and promoting the use of public transport, I need to plan the city and the community correspondingly. Until I continue to promote, as often happened so far, and you might have read articles on land consumption, land use. So farming land is used up every year for new settlements because of sprawling. So the more that happens, and the more you will promote the use of cars to the detriment of public transport. This is Sydney in Australia, but I could show you similar pictures in other geographical areas in Italy too. Well, this sourced by Newman and Kenwood, this chart makes it very clear. It shows various cities based on average density, based on the number of inhabitants per hectare, and based on energy consumption for transport. US cities, as well as Australian cities with the lowest densities, are those when energy consumption is higher because people use cars. As density increases in Europe, Latin America, and then Asia, when the number of inhabitants per hectare goes rocketing, then public collective transport becomes competitive. People use their cars less, and energy consumption drastically drop compared to the American model. Let me move towards a conclusion and quote three geographic and geopolitical factors. So far we've considered the short range. Let's make reference to a longer range. We've already talked about the spreading out of low-cost flights in the past 20-30 years, with a booming of a type of mobility which is extremely impactful in terms of CO2 and which continues to expand. Well, of course, we are very fearful when the pandemic is over and we go back to the levels of 2019. However, now we're witnessing a new form of tourism, which is called spatial tourism. We don't know about its development, but it certainly affects few people. 10-20 minutes of, let's say, permanence in the space, but with an individual flight, it entails CO2 emissions which are 30-50 times an intercontinental flight, long-range flight with emissions in the higher part of the atmosphere with greater damage. So this is a socio-economic as well as geographical aspect. And now the geopolitical strategies. These are the new Silk Roads promoted by China, especially to boost trade with the European Union, its first commercial partner. The conventional way crosses the Indian Ocean and then the Mediterranean and up to the Atlantic ports, but China is adding railway itineraries, not just to create goods transport on land, but is based on geopolitical reasons, to set up relations with states in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, to set up commercial relations, new outlet markets for their products, to stabilize relations in turbulent political eras. Just think of Kazakhstan or Ukraine. So promoting commercial relations that are more safe and reduce the risk of war. Up to a third way that, because of climate change, would go north of Russia, between Russia and the polar Arctic Circle, which would reduce the time required by 1/3, and at the same time would create bases to exploit the huge mining energy and fish resources in those areas. So very often behind the decision to build infrastructures, there are geopolitical strategies that are not just based on transport. And that's why I need to include that in my decisions when considering alternative choices. And since there's a course about migration and settlements too, there is a form of mobility which is not voluntary. It's forced by major socio-economic discrepancy on the earth. Every year, hundreds of millions of people move from the poor areas of the planet towards the richer areas, with migration flows that are not planned, that are often forced for people, and that touch upon a completely different dimension compared to transport only. Now, this has been a very quick review of a whole range of factors, but the aim was to show why humanities are key to pursue a more sustainable strategy about transport. Technological innovation that we always promote at Politecnico plays a key role, but its impact will be greater if we match it with sensitization, educational and information campaigns, if we break existing habits so as to promote the avoid and shift patterns which are necessary to integrate the technological improve required for more sustainable mobility. Thank you all.
Grazie a tutti.